My father was 92 when he died, and it's a wonder that he should have died at all, for he never grew old. His body just shriveled away. His arms grew as thin as a boy's. The skin that covered his old skull seemed tight and very thin, and his cheeks had begun to sink in. The legs that had walked down many deer in the mountains, legs as strong as a mule's, became thin and white, and quivered under the weight of his body. But he was not old. His mind still bloomed. As he had experienced life with a childlike awe at its unfolding, so too he anticipated death. He claimed death was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and he was going to be there to see it through. At the last, a creeping sort of weakness sent him to his bed once more. He was having trouble breathing. His heart, he said. His heart trouble had gotten serious some 40 years earlier, in 1954. He had a heart attack while he was out hunting in the Black Hills of Wyoming. Tom found him in the forest and pulled him out of the deep snow and brought him home. After that, he had several other heart attacks, and he dealt with them all in the same way, as if they were a temporary nuisance. There were more health problems, too, and he repeatedly found himself in and out of the hospital. He once went to the Mayo Clinic to have half his ulcerated stomach cut away. He fought cancer. Cancer had attacked his lungs, his prostate, his colon. But he'd beaten all of the operations and exceeded all of the doctor's expectations of how long he could hang on. We had talked about his dying. Was he afraid to die? He was not. "Remember, Gerry," he said just before he died, "when we cry over the dead, we are not crying over them. We are crying over our own loss. Wherever I go, I'll be all right." He seemed comfortable about death. He was ready for it. His business with himself and his children was finished, but his business with May, my stepmother, well, that was unresolved. How does a man leave the woman he's in love with? I arrived at his bedside the morning following his death. May had been with him at the last. He lay in their bedroom with his hands over the top of his covers as if he were sleeping. His face appeared peaceful. May left me with him in the bedroom. "Daddy," I said. No answer. I saw the shape of his mouth. Even in death, his mouth was shaped like mine, I thought. And in life, sometimes he formed his words like I form mine. "Daddy," I reached over and touched his hand. It was cold. Then I began to cry. I didn't try to fight the tears. People are permitted to cry over their dead fathers. And as he had said, the tears were not for him, but for me. After a while I said, "You were a mighty fine father," and I was glad I had taken the opportunity on many occasions to tell him so. "Were you with him when he died?" I asked May later. "Yes," she said. She had a distant look on her face and that small, sweet smile. I couldn't put the question quite right. "Well," she said, "I came into the bedroom, and he was having a hard time breathing. He was just in terrible labor, and I said, 'Honey, I wish you didn't have to struggle so hard.' And he said, 'Honey, I'd go, except I don't want to leave you alone.' And I sat down beside him," she said, "and I reached over and I took his hand, and I said, 'Honey, you can go.' And he looked up and smiled at me and closed his eyes, and he was gone." 14 is a fragile age for a boy. That evil potion, testosterone, surging unchecked in my veins, caused me to present nearly every classic sign and symptom of psychosis yet recorded. Reason had abandoned me. Without provocation, I found myself quarreling with authority, any authority, my father, my mother, my teachers. I began to suffer delusions of my perfect wisdom. My parents, once near deities to me, suddenly turned into strangers. In the developing throes of adolescence, I became obsessed with weird, nonsensical music, and I perfected the barbaric dance known as the jitterbug. Ask any father, any mother. If they speak to you forthrightly out of their dismay and grief, they will admit it. Their adolescent sons are, plainly put, quite simply deranged. That hormone, testosterone, is to blame. Indeed, the human male, his blood laced with testosterone, is the most dangerous of all creatures occupying the space on Earth. That loathsome hormone is responsible for most murders, most child and spousal abuse, most wars, and most of the other misery inflicted upon the Earth and her inhabitants. If we could drain testosterone from the blood, the brain would suddenly clear. Logic would reemerge, the eyes of killers would soften, and kindness and wisdom would prevail. In the waning days of that summer, I became the new kid at Laramie High School. I wish I could have understood the viciousness of the chemical that hurled me so wild-eyed and so ruthlessly psychotic into puberty. I grieve that I was blinded to the beauty of those two loving, blameless people who were helplessly lost in dealing with this teenaged maniac they had spawned. And for me to rediscover who I was would thereafter occupy the better part of my life to follow. Under the consuming influence of testosterone, I began to see my parents as simple, bothersome old fogies whose old-fashioned rules were disgustingly irrelevant to the likes of me. I felt trapped living with these strangers, and I wanted out, yet I was afraid to leave because I'd had no experience in independence. I remember the intense joy I felt in those glorious early fall days on the high Laramie plains, the sky clear, the air crisp, a joy that has since become more measured, and I sorrow over it, less passionate. I could smell the seasons then, and the smells intoxicated me. The great guys in my sophomore class soon made themselves known, and I thought, yes, I will become one of them. They were the football guys, the guys popular with the girls, the ones who ran things. The great guys were the ones who wore the best clothes, letter sweaters and cords faded white rolled up halfway to the knees. They wore their hair in a crew cut. I was greeted on the second day of school by a couple of the great guys, friendly guys who laughed at whatever I said. I felt proud, heady, important. The great guys wanted to meet me after school, walk home with me, get to know me. And that day after school, sure enough, two of them were waiting for me. And they did walk home with me. And when we got to my house, one of them asked, "Is that where you live?" "Yeah," I said. "Oh," the other great guy said. Then the two of them turned and walked away. Several days later, I found out what had caused the deterioration of my social standing. "Is it true that you live in a chicken house?" somebody asked me. "The hell I do," I said, proud and haughty. Then somebody else who knew a little Laramie history explained it. I lived in a house that had been added on to. Best house my father could afford, a gray stucco 3-bedroom affair. It had space in back for chickens and hutches for some rabbits I raised, butchered and sold. There was a garden, too, and a small barn. Yet I found out that our house had started as a chicken house, all right, and somebody knew that, and they spread the word. Spence lives in a chicken house. At Laramie High in 1943, you had to come from money or power. Your father had to be a businessman or a newspaper publisher. If not, you had to be a big-time personality boy or an athlete. I qualified for none of these. Well, I thought maybe I should try to become an athlete. I went out for football. Bad idea. Soon my body was mashed and squashed, reduced to a pulpy mess. I quit halfway through the season, and my father said, "If you quit, you have to get a job." I found work at Friday's Grocery across the street from the high school. In the years that followed, I worked at Garlett's Drug Store and Midwest Sporting Goods. I had money, enough to buy a pair of brown and white loafers, and so with my rolled-up cords, I looked like a great guy, even if I wasn't one. That's what fashion is about, looking like somebody you really aren't. At Laramie High, there was also a girl I shall call Judy, a freckle-faced Irish girl with a turned-up nose, a nice smile, and a happy personality. We went out one night in my father's '37 Ford, its fenders flapping like the wings of a wounded bird. After a movie, we found a dark spot on a country road to park. Nice kisses, none of those French kisses which, so far as Laramie High was concerned, had not yet been invented. And before I knew it, I'd lost my innocence right there in the back seat of the old '37 Ford. The next morning, I held back coming down the stairs. My parents could surely tell from my face what I'd done. Finally, about noon, I mustered the courage to face the music. My father was there to meet me as I descended the stairway. He stopped me before I could reach the landing. I could see it in his face. I had seen it before, drawn, his holding back the anger. "You should be proud of yourself," he said. My heart started to pound, and I got very lightheaded. "Why? What's the matter?" "Your mother is crying. You've almost killed her. She took the car to Sunday school this morning. She said some of the ladies were looking at the car when they came out of church, and they were snickering. Then he explained why. The condom I had thrown out of the back seat window the night before had stuck to the glass, and there it hung, the official flag of fornication, flying there for all the Sunday school ladies to see. It humiliated your mother to the point of dying, my father said. Hope you're real proud of yourself. The next summer I returned to the Lemke-Hermberg Ranch, a regular hand. Now I drove a mower with a team of young, powerful broncs, and later I stacked hay. My skinny arms grew muscles, and the other signs of manhood began to appear, and I felt like a man because, by God, I worked with men, and sweat with men, and I could cuss like a man, and spit and swagger, and if you saw me about half a mile away, you would have thought I was a man. Now that I was a man, old Kelsey, one of the hands, invited me to go with him to Rawlins, which was a man's town. So on a Saturday night I rode with old Kelsey in the ancient yellow pickup to the cozy rooms, which old Kelsey called home. It was, of course, a walk-up whorehouse. We sat down in the dingy parlor and we waited. The furniture was that overstuffed, cheap plastic kind with holes burned in the arms. The floors were old, worn green linoleum. Pretty soon the girls came in. 3 of them all decked out in those short, sexy little things, sexier than in any of my fantasies. When they walked in, they strutted their stuff sort of like models on a stage, and they walked up to where I was sitting and called me honey. I was singled out by a stringy blonde who led me down a narrow hall to her room. We sat side by side on a small bed that sagged in the middle and was covered with a worn pink chenille bedspread. I wondered if this was where she slept after all the men she had been with had finally gone home. It was $5 for what she called a short time. I gave her a 5, and when it was done, I walked out into the night, leaving old Kelsey behind. I was drained, yet suddenly sane. This night I had lain with a whore. All I could think to do was to say a humble prayer. Oh, God, forgive me, and please may I not get the clap. And please may I not get the sif, and may my folks never find out. Amen. I never got into much trouble at Laramie High. Drugs in any form were unheard of there in the mid-1940s. Most of the great guys didn't drink or smoke, but we did the jitterbug at the school dances. I could dance about as well as anybody, better than most. Although I was devoid of athletic skill, I was still a champion show-off. I'd developed a peculiar combination of shyness and extroversion. Sometimes I was the funny guy who managed to fall short of being funny, the cut-up who tried too hard, and who was often more obnoxious than amusing. But when you're not a great guy, your options are limited. You can fade into the woodwork, or you can be a smart-ass. The show-off part of me seemed endemic to my personality. In speech class, I loved to argue with our teacher, Velma Linford, a red-headed, busty woman who was as intransigent as a buffalo bull. But I, too, would never give up the argument. Finally, one day, I wore her down. "You get out of here," she hollered. "I'm kicking you out of this class." "How do you want me to go?" I asked with a smirk. "Any you want, just get out of here." I got up from my desk, walked to the window, opened it, and crawled out. Miss Linford, who was fond of me, had no sooner kicked me out than she began to miss me, and within the week I was back at my desk. "You ought to be a lawyer," she said once. I remembered that. I respected her spirit, her caring, and I felt loved by her. Of all of my teachers, she was perhaps the one most responsible for my early leaning toward the law. I was no natural scholar, but when my parents threatened that I couldn't go out unless my grades improved, I got straight A's. I liked literature. I liked drama. Drama fit my personality. I liked poetry, too. Poetry about feelings and the magic of words and sounds. I hated math and I hated science. Figures had no personality. You couldn't feel figures. I had grown up to understand from my earliest days that high school was merely the beginning of the educational process. Spences went to college, but I had to decide what I was going to study before I went to the university, so as not to waste a lot of life meandering around the university's educational smorgasbord. By my senior year, I had resolved that I should become a lawyer. I had never known a lawyer, never met one, never saw one. I'd never been in a courtroom. I had no idea what lawyers did, but Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, and he'd become president, and so was Jefferson and Madison, and I thought Roosevelt was probably a lawyer too. All great men were lawyers. I walked up to the law school one day on the University of Wyoming campus. The law school was fully contained in the upstairs of the old library building. I found the dean sitting in the outer office. "Who you looking for, son?" "Dean Hamilton," I said. "I'm Dean Hamilton," he said. "What can I do for you?" He got up and shook my hand like he was pumping water. He was a tall, straight man, bald as a hen's egg. He gave me a smile like they were free and told me to sit down. "I think I'd like to be a lawyer," I said. "Well, now, isn't that fine?" he replied. "Why?" "I don't know," I said. "Figured I'd be good at it." "That's as good a reason as any," he replied. The entire law school occupied only 3 classrooms, and the faculty was composed of 4 professors, including the dean. 20 or 30 kids usually started each fall, about half of whom flunked out the first quarter. The dean told me if I wanted, I could take an aptitude test to see if I was mentally and psychologically suited for the profession. I said, okay. I saw through the test right away and answered every question consistent with what I believed were the characteristics of a lawyer. The dean retrieved my test paper and in a few minutes was back. He seemed very excited, and he had a glorious smile on his face. "You've just earned the highest score on this aptitude test I have ever witnessed in all of my days as dean. Congratulations, son. You're going to become a very great lawyer." "Thank you," I said. "I'll see you in a couple of years," the dean hollered after me as I strutted out of the law library and into my life. Yes, law, whatever it was, however you did it, however you got to the top of it, well, that was for me. I was going to be a lawyer. A great lawyer, by God, the greatest. Two men in navy blue business suits came from my father. I didn't follow them into the bedroom. Efficient movers, these men. Shortly they came wheeling out a gurney bearing a cleanly pressed gray corduroy zipper bag. My father. Yet the bag looked so small. The men in blue pushed the gurney past me and went on out the front door. My youngest son, Kent, was with me. I grabbed his hand and held it like a small child's. This son, already nearly 40, standing taller than I by several inches. The high, white August sun shone brightly as the men in blue rolled the gurney with the small gray bag up to the back of a white van, the kind plumbers drive. They pushed the gurney inside and drove off. "Just like that," I said to Kent. "Just like that." That's how it ended my father's 92 years on this earth. Just like that. It was August 12th, 1992. I think my father would have liked the way it ended. No fuss, no flowers, no fancy show, no wailing, just a gray bag and the back end of a white van. And after that, life goes on. He had written an autobiography and ended it by speaking of May and his children. These 4 extraordinary individuals have taught me how to live and to love. They have stood by me through sickness and health. These beautiful people have made my life full, so full that sometimes I almost burst. I must have done something right. And I thought, yes, that was enough for any man. Winter in Laramie was like living in a wind tunnel, the temperature well below zero, the place unfriendly and bitter. When you stepped outside, you felt as if you'd been slapped in the face, the wind that strong and mean. I felt trapped in Laramie, as I later felt trapped in other towns. I had not yet learned that I dragged my trap with me. At that time, all I knew was I had to get the hell out. Out of the house, out from under my folks, out of Laramie, out. College and law school would have to come later. Right now, I had to escape. One night, about Christmas time, I announced at the supper table, "I'm getting the hell out of here." My parents didn't believe in argument. My father said nothing, just looked sad. My little brother and sister sat looking down at their plates. Why the hell couldn't somebody say something? My mother stared at her hands in silence. The next Sunday morning I announced that I was leaving. The semester was over. I decided to hitchhike to San Diego. My buddy Jim Brown and I were going to go to sea. "What about your graduation?" my mother asked, her eyes sad. But except for the first glance when she spoke, she didn't look at me. She had never mentioned that she'd wanted to attend my graduation ceremony. Never said that getting her son through high school day, too. Jim Brown didn't go for that brand of bullshit either. Made him sick, he said. He'd arrived in Laramie his junior year, a boy my age, and without parents. His father had died early of a stroke. His mother had died as well. Well, by God, Jim and I were buddies, and the two of us would get the hell out of school and seek our fortune. Jim was smarter than I, nice-looking kid who knew what it was all about. He was going to be a lawyer, too. That Sunday, my father had already gotten dressed for church, his old blue suit, his white socks showing, the same old shoes he'd worn to church for 10 years, a thin old-fashioned tie. My mother was wearing her same Sunday dress, the red one, and her straw hat with a feather in it. My little sister Barbara was all decked out in her curls and her new flowered dress my mother had made, and she wore thin baby blue ribbons in her hair. My little brother Tom was wearing a freshly pressed white Sunday shirt and his own clip-on bow tie. My mother tried not to say anything hurtful, but just the pain in her eyes told the story. My father was silent as usual. My mother had let me take the same old black metal suitcase we'd lugged to my grandparents when I was a child. She kissed me goodbye and told me to say my prayers, trying to say something else I could tell, but she couldn't get it out. I promised I'd write. I was in a hurry to get the misery of leaving over with. I said, "Dad, could you drive me out to the highway?" He looked at me surprised, and then he saw my suitcase standing there at the door, and he didn't say anything. He grabbed it and tossed it in the back seat and said, "Come on." Then he drove the old Ford to U.S. Highway 30, headed west. It was cold, and a high Laramie wind was blowing. At the edge of town, my father let me off. I shook his hand in the way a man shakes the hand of a man. I got out of the car with my bag, and I stood there on the road alone. Then he revved up the old Ford, made a big U-turn in the middle of the highway, and headed the car back toward home. Me standing there in the wind and the blowing snow on the empty road. I turned to watch, and for the last time I saw the old Ford, saw it disappear down the street, its fenders still flapping. I turned my head into the wind and waited for something to throw my thumb at. I had $15 in my pocket, and I wasn't going to starve to death. I could get work, but I was going to freeze my ass off if a car didn't come along and pick me up pretty quick. Then somebody did come. It was always that way for me. Somebody always came along to save me. That's the way it is for me, even today. 4 days later, I was in San Diego. California was a make-believe place, all warm and balmy in the winter, with palm trees, soft, wet air. How could there be such a place as this? I would never go back to Wyoming. I hoofed it up to the private school where Jim was staying, and he packed his bags, and that was it. The next day we signed on as messmen on the SS Roanoke, a scummy, derelict old tanker. No self-respecting seaman would think of boarding the Roanoke. Consequently, it was the only ship offering work to a first-time seaman. She was scheduled for Port Arthur, Texas, through the Panama Canal. Jim was assigned to the officers' mess and I to the crew's mess. The steward, a fat, rat-faced, black-haired Texan of about 50, was in charge of both dining rooms. He fed his men well, had to get anybody to stay on the Roanoke. The next morning I was awakened by a strange rumbling noise. I jumped out of my bunk and ran out on deck to see what was happening. The entire ship was vibrating. Suddenly I realized the Roanoke's old engines were thumping away down in the hold. Then I saw the deckhands working the lines, hauling the gangplank, and I heard the swish, swish, swish of the screw churning the water. Finally, the old ship eased out backwards into the harbor, and we were sailors. Yes, sailors. "Well, here we go," I said to Jim. "Right," he said, a big grin on his face, his eyes all distant and squinty. And that's all he said. We sailed through the Panama Canal, and I loved the heat, the feel of sweat on my body, the warmth in the low, deep winter sun. The countryside was lush and green. It was a paradise out there, little jutting islands that pushed out of the ocean like green moss-covered stumps. Everywhere there were palms and clear, deep, calm water. Then one morning I was awakened by silence. The background rumble of the engines had stopped. Nothing but the quiet slush of water against the tub's old iron sides. I stumbled out of my tiny bunk in the hold and ran to the poop deck to find the old Roanoke docked. Acres of oil tanks, refinery stacks in the distance, ugly place, barren of greenery, Port Arthur, Texas. That night we got drunk in the first saloon we could find, the steward, Jim, I, and the cook. Big time we were, smoking, and big time drunk on straight shots of Seagram 7 with a beer chaser. The saloon was soggy from wall to wall, in uproar and racket, with seamen plastered up against the walls and hanging like slabs of beef from the bar. The place smelled like 100 bottles of booze, and sweat and piss and cheap hair grease, and the musk of 100 foul-breathed men. We visited body houses in Galveston, then Jim and I retired to the poker houses and played the games with the big boys for the big money, sometimes $5 a throw. 5-card stud and draw poker. We sat at the round, green velvet-covered tables in the smoky back rooms, sat there straight-faced, looking mean, looking tough, smoking our big cigars, not talking, not looking up. I was inexperienced, but I was winning. Despite the unwritten law of poker players that prohibits the display of emotion, sometimes I couldn't contain my anger at the luck of the draw, and I would slam the cards down on the table in disgust and throw in the hand. At other times, after I'd sneaked a peek and was overjoyed at what I saw, I couldn't help but come out with a joyous, "Jesus Christ!" The old hands with those dried-up, brittle psyches thought I was bluffing, because no honest-to-God poker player is honest. The bluff is the essence of the game, the empty face. Poker is a game of lies, but to let the truth hang out? Not a veteran poker player, not even the houseman, understood the confounding power of the truth. Later in the courtroom, my seasoned opponents would saunter into court in their blue pinstripe suits and their pretty silk ties, these men of great intelligence who were steeped in the sauce of cynicism and soaked in the brine of distrust. But they were no better suited to understand the power of truth than were those tin-horn gamblers in Galveston. Between us, Jim and I won $20. Big night. We vacated the premises and swaggered on down the waterfront, grabbed a cab, and headed back to the ship. When you're 16, you don't think about life. You're in it. You do it. We shipped out of Port Arthur on the Liberty tanker Christopher Shoals, Jim Brown and I. This time we shipped out as ordinary seamen, deckhands. We fought the rust on the iron deck, hauled docking lines, manned the winches, and stood watch at night. In the night I gazed up at the stars, and I thought the serious thoughts of boys. I thought how the stars had been made by God, and then I wondered who made God. And then I wondered who made whoever it was who made God, and I threw up my arms and talked to the stars. Up there on the bow of the ship at night, I thought about my mother, too, that sweet little farm girl who'd never tasted liquor, smoked a cigarette, run wild with the men, who had instead devoted her life to her family and church. I thought of her innocence and how she'd surely die if she knew the sins this son of hers had committed. And my father? Well, my father knew some things all right, but he'd never been in a whorehouse in Galveston or gone to the beach with a naked girl in Aruba. My father, so brave and tough, knew nothing about the real world, the world I was in. Yet, try as I did, I couldn't shed the country boy in me, nor quiet the pesky voice that shamed me. And I now recount with recurring sorrow that as a teenage sailor in those old romantic ports, I saw only the bars and the poker houses and the bordellos. That fall, Jim Brown and I returned to Laramie. Nothing had changed. My upstairs room was the same. Town was the same. The wind the same. My folks the same. They treated me with a little more respect, I thought. Maybe it was a little more distance. I'd seen the world, you know, and they'd seen nothing. Jim and I enrolled at the university. Pre-law, by God, going to be a big-time lawyer. I was 17. Of course, my mother knew how her son had departed from the way. I knew she knew. I could feel it. She could probably smell the smoke and the booze. She had a nose for sin. Sometimes I could tell she couldn't bear to look at me, and when she did, she looked as if she were going to burst into that sucked-in, almost silent crying of hers. One day I learned the truth about my mother's intentions for me. I'd just come down the stairs from my room, and there am I crying all night. Again? What the hell have I done this time? Your mother was driving home from the church the other day and saw you walking down the street with a cigarette in your mouth. You know how she feels about that." "Oh, for Christ's sakes," I said. "And that, too, you're swearing. These days you don't show much respect for your parents or for what you've been taught." I followed him into the kitchen. He started flipping his flapjacks. He usually cooked breakfast on Sunday. He put a pile of 3 flapjacks on a plate and handed it to me. He said, "When little Peggy died of meningitis, your mother made a bargain with God. A lot of little kids were dying of it, and you'd been exposed. Well, if God would spare you, she'd agree to give you to God. And now your mother thinks she's been a failure as a mother, and she thinks she's broken her bargain with God. Wouldn't hurt you to at least go to church with her today, make her happy." So I went to church with her, the old brick church that looked like every other Methodist church in the world. The black and white marquee out front advertising the title of the sermon nobody wanted to hear. A squat, square bell tower with no bell, that was it. She didn't say anything to me about the smoking, and I said nothing to her about her having given me to God without my permission. I was a better poker player than most of the hands at sea. I watched the people more than the cards. I'd won a lot of money playing poker, maybe $500 or $600, and I'd banked these winnings in my college fund. I believed that I was pretty smart with the cards. There were card rooms down below the body houses on Front Street in Laramie, so why wouldn't a smart poker player like me go down there and play a little poker with the boys, make something of myself at an early age? The old pros, their faces wrinkled and yellow, gathered at Hicks' card room like a pack of aging, hungry jackals waiting for prey. They never dreamed that Sister Luck would deliver them some smart-ass country boy fresh from his virgin tour of the sea. The old pros were dried-up, emotionless drones who played their cards close to their chest. They memorized the cards and played the odds. They were living, breathing poker machines who never smiled, never laughed, never joked, and they had a nose for a sucker. After a couple of months, I'd lost my entire college funds, $50, $100 a night. But I learned more at Hicks' card room than in any book concerning the underlying rules of jurisprudence, namely, that those who run the card games always win. The house never loses. The power structure stays in power, and we are the players. In the fall of 1946, at 17, I was dead broke. I began to look at my life anew. Who was I? What kind of a fool? I had lost every dollar I'd saved, but I'd lost more than the money. I'd done what I'd done because I was bad, and the bad had caught up with me. How could I face my mother? How could I tell my father? And how could I ever face old Grandpa Spence, who used to brag that the Spences never had been famous, but there wasn't a drunk or a felon among 'em? How could that sweet old man bear learning that his grandson had become nothing but a common two-bit gambler? I thought about killing myself, but I was too much of a coward to kill myself. Moreover, my mother had told me about suicide. God will forgive anything you do if you ask Him, she had argued, even murder. But if you kill yourself, how can you ask God's forgiveness? Suicide is the one and only unforgivable sin a person can commit. She had said it so many times, and I understood. No, I would never kill myself. The first fall rain descended on Laramie in a fine drizzle, turning the night pavement into reflecting black mirrors. The red neon lights of the bus depot stretched in long, wavy patterns across the wet street, and the engines in the switchyards whistled and whined in the rain. I walked alongside my mother in the rain, my small brother and sister in tow, and then we all boarded the Greyhound bus. My mother looked on as the drivers stowed their bags in the bus's hatch, and after the family had taken their seats, I kissed Barbara and Tom goodbye. I also kissed my mother, just a peck, and then I walked off the bus. Before they boarded, my mother had said, "You know we're not leaving you, Jerry. You're a man now. You can take care of yourself." "Right," I said. But I was not a man. I knew that, and she knew that. I pulled my chin back and turned my mouth down a little, tilted my head from side to side, and all the while inside I wrestled back the sobs. How could she say she wasn't leaving me when she was walking out to that bus to leave? "We'll be back in 3 short years," my mother said. "You write often," I said, as she had said to me. "Doesn't cost much to write." I hadn't written often when I was at sea. My father had taken a job in 1946 as a chemist with the Patino tin mines in Bolivia, and my mother had seemed excited about the adventure. Said she had always wanted to go to strange places and see new things. She planned to be a missionary to the native people there. My family would be living in a high native village near the mine, a place called Catavi. My father had signed a 3-year contract with the Bolivian company. I had never seen him so happy. He'd always wanted to see the rest of the world, this Colorado country boy. My father had gone to Bolivia ahead of the family to get things set up and safe for them. My mother stayed back, sold the house, and I had to move out. Jim Brown and I took a basement room in a prim white frame house, $25 a month between us. I marched off the bus and walked off into the cold night rain. Didn't wait to see the bus pull out. I felt alone. I walked the deserted streets, the street lights glaring, the sound of the rain running in the gutters. I began to sob out loud. As I walked by Hicks's card room, the same dried-up old bastards were staring at the table through the smoke. And then I knew that Laramie, Wyoming, was truly a place of the dead. While the old pros were feasting on the last of my savings down at Hick's card room, the fraternities and sororities were conducting Rush Week, when they invited certain interesting freshman candidates to their houses. There the rushies were carefully inspected for their style and dress, for their personalities and pedigrees. I was not invited, and in my heart I knew why. I was a nobody. It hurt to be nobody, but I never admitted it to anyone. I didn't know it then, but whereas I was unlucky in poker, I had drawn a straight flush in the draw of life. I didn't yet understand that the world I ached for was mostly superficial, mostly empty. My not having been chosen was one of the great gifts of my life. I dare not consider what might have been my lot had I acquired the precious fraternity pin. What if playing golf with the president of the local bank had defined the meaning of my life? What if my life was won or lost depending upon the clubs I belonged to or the cocktail parties I attended? What if I ended up representing banks who robbed the poor rather than representing the poor, some of whom robbed the banks? What if after a lifetime I had no extra chamber in my heart for the widow mopping the toilets and the laboring man coughing in the mine? Years later was to make arguments to the jury that bore the fruit of these early snuffs. Petty events often reveal large truths. Many times I have reminded a jury how, having experienced small rejections ourselves, we learn something of the origins of crime. Criminals are not born, I have argued. See him in the crib, this man who stands charged before you. See his face, no larger than my fist, wrinkled against the light. He looks no different from the newborn in the crib next to him. But at the moment of his birth, this child was branded as a nothing, as a worse than nothing. So my mother wanted me to preach? Well, often I preached to the jury. Over and over I have argued that our fate is mostly a matter of vision. Most of us try to fulfill our visions. In the ghetto, the unjustly branded child sees little more than a life of crime. Give me the child born in the ghetto, I have cried. Let us lift him out of these venal concrete boxes and take him into the wide-open spaces of Wyoming. Let him see the majesty, the beauty of our mountains. Give him another vision. Give him parents like you, who are educated and loving and responsible. Give him an education where his vision can be further expanded. Give him another vision, and the child will discover another way. This man was punished when he was born. Punished and adjudged and labeled and rejected. Shall we punish him again? Reject him again? Might we not show him that there's something left in this world called love? That there are people who care, and that those people sit on this jury? At last, cannot love conquer hate? I thought my mother would have liked the preaching. I got a job as night bellman at the Connor Hotel, best hotel in town, 30 cents an hour. And later that year, until the following spring, I worked as a switchman for the Union Pacific Railroad. Night work down in the yards, making up the trains, dangerous work, hanging on the side of a moving car, dirty work, In the morning, after a full shift, a fellow came in dirty as old rags and bone-tired, and in the deep winter, the marrow of a fellow's bones was about half frozen. In the clear mornings, fresh off the switching trains, I stomped into my 8 o'clock class wearing my dirty overalls and my heavy work shoes with the steel toes. My face was smeared with soot, and I still carried my switchman's lantern in my lunch pail. I sat them under my desk and looked around. Of course, none of the girls in the class looked at me. None of them but one. Her name was Anna Fidelia Wilson, a tall, bright bluebell of a girl with blonde hair and good stuff in her sweater. The thing I liked about Anna Wilson was her air, the way she carried herself, proud as a poodle, kind of prancy. She walked like she knew where she was going, and she had that smile on her face that punched in a dimple, one in either cheek. She'd seen me in that 8 o'clock class, and she'd smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a smile of amusement or pity. It was a nice sort of friendly smile, and I smiled back the best I could. I saw her at a school dance, and when I asked her what she liked to do, she said she was learning to play tennis. And I said, well, I like to play tennis too. And so we met the following morning at 6 o'clock at the tennis courts. I'd never played the game. Very soon I came to realize that we had not come to play tennis. We'd come to carry on where we paused the night before. I swung at the ball and missed, and then I missed again and again, and when I couldn't hit the first ball, I had to do something. I ran to the net and jumped over, and I took Anna Fidelia Wilson in my arms, and I kissed her, and after that there was no turning back. To that move I can trace every act, every decision, nearly every agony, every one of my children, most of the compelling forces of my life, the very metamorphosis of my being. I can also trace to that exact instant the rebirth of the man known as Gerry Spence. From that moment we were inseparable. I could not live without Anna. She introduced me to parts of me I had never known, showed me wondrous things about me. She found me different, exciting, engaging, creative, handsome and sexy, she said. I thought she was blind. She loved me, and I did love her. Love is how we feel toward those who show us that which is lovable about ourselves. Ah, Anna Fidelia Wilson. When she smiled at me, the angels sang. She wore expensive clothes, and oh, she was stylish. And I, this nobody, this commoner, had somehow attracted her. I must be somebody after all. With Anna Fidelia Wilson, I was somebody. I called her Sugar. Whatever we had together, and we called it love, was a magical potion that had rendered me, the ugly, beautiful. Anna was the adopted daughter of the H.R. Wilson family. H.R. was a solid, balding man in his late 50s who, although he was a strong man, had the right amount of gentleness to him. Next to my father, he was the most wise, decent, and honorable man I have ever known, and I loved him. H.R. Wilson had met and married Mabel when he was a man past 40, and she was foxy and young. She was tall, wispy, pretty as showgirls are pretty. She was also exciting, worldly, alive, impetuous, and she laughed and hollered and screamed and butchered the king's English, and you could hear her coming a mile away in city traffic. She smoked long cigarettes and swore like a drill sergeant, and she often drank whiskey of an evening before dinner. She'd had little education, hadn't seemed to need much. She had 2 closets full of expensive dresses and 100 pairs of high-heeled shoes, a large opulent home, and 2 cars, a DeSoto and an Oldsmobile. Mabel was one of those women who had the power to make a man feel as if he were the greatest gift to the universe since Clark Gable. According to Mabel, I was intelligent beyond words, exquisitely handsome, and wonderfully funny. She called me her son, and I loved her too. I spent the summer of 1947 in the hayfields of the old Fred Boyce Ranch outside of Cheyenne. Anna was working as a secretary for the Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce. That fall, I went back to school. But Anna had been exiled by her parents to Denver in a last-ditch hope that if they could pry these mating beasts apart, perhaps Anna would apply herself to something, anything, even to the business of being a secretary. Maybe she could learn shorthand and bookkeeping and become an expert typist, make something of herself. They had enrolled her in Barnes Business College in Denver, but the plan wasn't working. Anna saved her food allowance to come see me. When she'd saved enough, she'd grab the bus to Laramie, half sick from starvation and from love. Anna wasn't doing well at Barnes Business College either. Anna and I had talked about getting married. Mr. Wilson had given up on her education. He couldn't keep us apart. Anna couldn't concentrate at school, and had come home at the end of the school year and never gone back. She was working as a secretary. They might as well get married, Mr. Wilson said. What else can a father do? We were both 19. I figured I could get married in my Levi's, but a man should wear a suit to his wedding, especially if the bride was to make her march on the arm of her father down the long hall of the Methodist Church in her white gown, dragging behind her a long train of satin. And so I bought a blue serge suit, J.C. Penney's, a red silk tie with a painted feather, a white shirt, and new black shoes. I married Anna Fidelia Wilson on the 20th day of June, 1948. I don't remember repeating the vows. I don't remember kissing the bride or slipping the ring on her finger or her slipping one on mine. I have no memory of the reception or cutting the cake. I remember nothing at all until all at once I found myself driving through the rain in Mr. Wilson's new DeSoto, which I had borrowed for our honeymoon, and sitting proudly next to me was Anna, my new bride. I was a man, all right, just as my mother had said, and those who said a 19-year-old was just a kid had never met me. Our plan called for a honeymoon under the stars in the Snowy Range Mountains a few miles south of Laramie, romantic and very cheap. It was raining, but it didn't matter. We were in love, and the rain would go away. I had intended to search out a secluded spot by a murmuring stream, chop some pine boughs with my hatchet, spread my bedroll gently over the boughs, down my love with tenderness and joy, and there launch the matrimonial ship. We had brought some potatoes and some Hershey chocolate bars. We were ready. But the rain and the fog. I turned onto a small dirt road, but the roadway was flooded, and suddenly the DeSoto was stuck in the mud. I looked around. Through the rain I could see, as in the story of Goldilocks, a small cabin in the trees. "Come on," I said. We ran for the cabin. It was locked. I broke out a small pane of glass in the door, reached in, and opened the latch from the inside. "Enter, my princess," I declared. The cabin was a one-room log structure, a bed in the corner, dry kindling stacked behind a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room. I built a fire, and when the place was warm and the coals were glowing, I threw in the potatoes, after which we feasted on a wedding supper of roasted potatoes and Hershey bars. In the morning we began to make up the bed, and I found out something I didn't know about some women. They want their beds made in a certain way. "Make the corners square like this," she said. "What for?" I asked. "Because that's the way you do it. You can make your corners square. I don't like square people, and I don't like square corners." "They make square corners in a hospital," she said. "This isn't a hospital," I said. "They make square corners in a 4-star hotel." "I suppose this is a 4-star hotel," I said. Suddenly she rushed over to my side of the bed and pushed me aside to make the corner square herself. "You are a son of a bitch," she hissed through her teeth. As certain benign chemicals blow up when joined, what followed in that innocent cabin was the first of an endless series of spontaneous explosions that the Union would suffer, mostly over matters of little more consequence than making corners square. Memories can be kind, and mine has dimmed as dynamite dust settles into the timeless void. But I remember in its clearing that Anna was crying. Then I went to her and pulled her to me, and I held her, and she wept and I wept, and after that we made the bed corners square. "I always did like square corners, sugar," I said. She laughed, and I wiped her tears away. When we left, I put a piece of cardboard over the broken pane to keep the weather out, and I wrote a note to the owners and left it on the kitchen table with $2 to pay for the small pane of glass I'd broken. The rain had stopped, and the day was bright. I freed the DeSoto from the mud, and my bride and I headed down the road to Laramie, to life in all of its exuberant abundance.